Hi everyone. Today we come to a lovely little section of Psalm 18. We're going to be thinking of verses 20 to 24. It might be worth reading those verses. In verse 19, David had said, He, in other words God, rescued me because He delighted in me. In verses 20 to 24, David elaborates on why God delighted in him. And we could sum up what he has to say in this sentence. David truly sought to live his life according to God's word. Now we have to be careful when reading these verses in which David speaks about his righteousness, about the cleanness of his hands, about keeping the way of the Lord, about not departing from God, about God's rules being before him and keeping God's statutes and so on. David isn't saying that he is sinless. He's not saying that his relationship with God is based on his own righteousness, his ability to keep God's law, and that's why God saved him. No. What he is saying is that the way of life, how he lives, is something that is a consequence of his relationship with God. It flows out of his relationship with God. His relationship with God is a relationship based on faith, and because he has this relationship, he wants to live in order to please the Lord. The way he lived proved that he was a child of God. So what David is saying is that the general overall tenor of his life was that of godly living, seeking to obey and honour God. He's not saying that he never sins. He's saying that sin is not his way of life. It's not what characterises his life in general. And with that in mind, let's listen to his testimony. Verses 20 and 21, he says this: The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. David had previously said that he called on God for help, and when he called on God, God heard him. But in case anyone thought that all you had to do to get God's help in a difficult situation in life was to call out to God, David makes it clear here that God's answer to his call was based upon and because of the fact that he was a child of God and was living as a child of God. In other words, the ungodly, the wicked, have no claim whatsoever upon God's blessing in their lives and God's help in their trouble. They cannot derive unwarranted comfort from God's readiness to help his children. And of course, that's because the ungodly and the wicked are not God's children. David lived as a child of God. He lived out his faith in the Lord. He was blameless before the Lord. He says, I kept myself from guilt. This is how David, in general, lived his life. In verse 24, he speaks about the cleanness of his hands. And what that points to is honesty, sincerity, innocence. Certainly with regards to the things that others were saying against him, David knew he was completely innocent. He honestly wasn't doing the things that people were saying he was doing. David knew what was required of him by the law of God. And in all sincerity, with honesty in his heart, David sought to live by God's standards, by God's law at all times. Now, there were times when he fell. Yes, he sinned. But that was due to human frailty, not to outright iniquity. Let me say that again. He sinned due to human frailty, not to outright iniquity. One writer says, frailty the author could not deny. Outright iniquity he could deny. That brings me to ask myself and to ask you the question, what about us, brethren? Could we take David's words in this little section from verses 20 to 24 as our own words? Are these things true of us? Do we keep God's law before us every day? Do we not push God's requirements away and want to have nothing to do with them? Are we able to say with David, I have kept the ways of the Lord. I have kept myself from guilt. Now, like David, none of us can say that in an absolute sense. None of us are perfect. None of us go through a day without failing. But is the overall tenor of my life and of your life one of godliness like David? If God comes to the help of the righteous when they're in trouble, if God blesses and rewards the righteous, will he reward you and me? Will he come to your help and my help? Because the general tenor of our life is that we keep the ways of the Lord. May God give you and give me the grace this day to walk in the ways that David walked. Every blessing to you as you come to the weekend, and may God bless you on the Lord's day.